David Trudon, I hope I am pronouncing your name correctly, David, is waiting to join us. David is the product manager for online news and podcast producer at SME.sk. 3 years ago, David and his team decided to go into podcasting when barely anyone in the country knew what podcast was. 3 years later, they have a core audience of roughly 30,000 daily listeners. David, tell us more about this success and how you became a pioneer of podcasts in Slovakia.
Hey guys, great to be part of the summit. Yeah, actually, it was just an experiment which we started with, and it was successful. I mean, I have some of the steps in the presentation, like what I think we did right. Obviously, I'm sharing some of the things we failed at, because there's always that. But generally, I think the management of the newsroom was actually bold enough to let this experiment, proceed. So that was a big part of it. Okay, so let me start with sharing the story in length, or like maybe in short, and then we will get to podcasting and memberships and subscription. I guess more people are interested in that. So basically, almost to date, we started 3 years ago. That there was like no one doing seriously podcasting in Slovakia. Obviously, every country has some like independent podcasters. Be it here in Europe, in any country, in Africa, in Asia. So you'll find podcasters like there's not a country in the world. Okay, maybe North Korea, but there's like no country in the world where there aren't any podcasters like independent. And so we started doing this like a little bit more seriously. So we actually looked at the success the New York Times was having, and we were actually what's the anyway, so we looked at that, what the New York Times was doing, and we said like, yeah, why not try it? I mean, they have 1,700 people working at the newsroom. We only have like 100, so what's the big difference there? So let's set it up. So the setup was quite simple. So every day, so we agreed it will be a daily podcast, like one host and one guest. The guest will be almost always from the newsroom, so that we cut costs, but not costs that you're paying for the guest, but obviously like time costs, where you need to have someone, a producer, who is getting you guests and so on. So this was actually, I think, a really great thing that the Times did, because before that, like many podcasts were like there was a podcaster who was getting outside guests, and there was some logistics needed. And another thing we did was no cutting, right? Like you have to do it at one take, like the whole interview. If there's like a small problem, we sometimes left it in, sometimes not. I mean, since then we got quite professional. And on the chart you can see the accumulated downloads, listens, because we calculated together Apple Podcast, Spotify, and everything. Spotify says it has streams, Apple Podcast has downloads, so it's like not super clean data, but it gives us roughly a good overview of how the podcast listening is growing. And that's like the amount of how much more people listen to podcasts, like year over year, month over month. So like we are this year, almost every month this year, we were hitting like over 1 million downloads, like on all of our podcasts, which is almost 20 today together. And one more thing, when we started, like we didn't set up a team. there was like no podcasting. We said like, okay, so we will do this without no money. We'll try, and so we distributed the production. Meaning, there were like 15 people who were doing like small little things, right? So we had the cameraman of our video production, who became actually the one who was recording the podcast. So there were the journalists who would need to come in for 15 to 20 minutes to talk about a certain topic. There was the host of the podcast who needed to prepare. Then there was someone else who was putting it together, someone else who was publishing it. I mean, by now we kind of like switched it around, and there's like a dedicated team, and that's because we were able to build up this team, because podcast actually became profitable for us very very quickly. Like we got like we have ads in our podcast, and so that's one way we make money, and the other way is subscription, but I'll get to that. And so in the beginning we thought like, okay, so this is going great, and like we should add podcast to our subscription strategy. And so I'll get to that. Okay, so as Vera said, we are averaging around daily like around 30,000 listeners on our most popular like daily news podcast. So I was doing a little bit of math. The New York Times is daily is reaching on average per episode 4 million listeners. So if you were counting per capita and our podcast was in the US, this would be roughly 2 million, like the size of the country. So just to get, I'm not saying like we're as popular by no means, but when you look at how big is the country, I think this is actually really successful. And the podcast, like our daily news podcast, is one of our flagship products of the newsroom. I was asking Barbara, the speaker before, like how many people are listening to podcasts in Poland, because we actually have an agency, a research agency called Two News in Slovakia, who is regularly doing this. They ask roughly 1,000 people like if they listen to podcasts, so they do this research. And so the latest number from March was that 21% of like people who are connected to the internet in Slovakia listen to podcasts, which is quite a lot. In Germany, it's I believe around 17% based on the Edison research. In the US, it's 26, I guess. So I mean, it's not bad. There's like definitely room to grow. And maybe one of the last comparisons with the US. I know we're obsessed with the US, but they're like so far ahead in podcasting that it's just like you compare yourself. And so it turns out the top genres of the podcasting are not that different. In the US, number one is comedy. In Slovakia is actually news podcast. I forgot to mention what happened when we started doing our podcast. Like our colleagues were, I'm not going to say they were laughing, but they were like they did. They have seen that they saw that it was an experiment, and they were just like waiting, you can say. And when they kept seeing that our numbers, of listeners, podcast downloads were growing, they joined in. So that was great. And they're actually every major news media in Slovakia now has a daily news podcast, like internet online media. So that's great. Like there's competition, there's healthy competition, and usually when someone is a podcast listener, they just turn up, listening to all the daily news. So basically, they have like 1 hour in the morning listening all to the daily news podcast, and so they know a lot. Society and culture is kind of a genre where like these kind of talk shows, when you have influencers or YouTubers getting their own podcast. So usually they attribute their podcast to this genre of podcast. And obviously comedy is in Slovakia number 3, but in US thanks to Joe Rogan and similar, comedians. The podcast genre of comedy in US is very strong. So we have again some stand-up comedians in Slovakia that are actually making part of their living doing a podcast, and that's a great thing to see. Like I think it's very healthy for the whole podcast ecosystem. Okay, so what a few things we got right, at least what I think. Like in the beginning when we started the podcast, like SME has print paper and also an online edition, which is very well read. So in the beginning, like most of our listeners came through our website, they clicked the audio player within the article, they visited, and that's how they listened to our podcast. And we were really pushing for them to subscribe to our podcast, to keep them somehow attached to the podcast, because that's what you want. You want them to, you want anyone who listens to your podcast to be, subscribing, so that anytime you publish a new podcast, it just flows in their podcast player. Another thing which was like really great for us, and I have seen other speakers saying this, that building a community is really, really really important. We started a Facebook group, which turned out a really great tool for us. Right from the beginning, we get a lot of feedback. We have ongoing discussion. Anything we want to brainstorm with a couple thousand people, we just do it there. Our Facebook group members are like super responsive. The discussion is actually very nice. We don't get a lot of trolls. The group is actually closed. We found out that's better than to keep it open. So I mean, anyone can join. We'll approve them, but we do a little bit of check, like who's joining the group. Because from time to time you get like 30, 50 people applying to get into the group, and when you check them out, they are like actually just dummy accounts. So I really recommend having a closed Facebook group. From the beginning, we every month, I think I only missed 1 month. This is my job actually still, but till this day. Like after each month, we publish a pretty extensive article saying what are the stats, how many people listened, what are the averages, how different various podcasts are doing, how many people listen through Apple Podcasts, how many people listen to Spotify, what was the average length of the podcast, and so this kind of like data transparency in terms of sharing as much as we can turned out like to be a great tool, because that was how other media in the beginning could see like how podcasts are growing, and they could jump in. That's another way how advertisers stumble upon us, and they kind of instantly know like what is the group they are reaching. And actually turns out that our listeners are interested how different podcasts are going. So obviously almost everyone listens to the daily news podcast, but some of them have like their favorite weekly podcast, and they're just like curious how they are doing. They're curious what new podcasts we want to start, and it's kind of an ongoing discussion also in terms of data. We never stopped actually explaining what a podcast is. Like even in Western countries, you still get people who are asking like, what is a podcast? How do I listen to a podcast? Like the best thing you can do is always explain what the podcast is. If you can get like someone famous to explain people what the podcast is. So there were these like two celebrities in Slovakia who started the podcast, like one stand-up comedian turned TV host, and another actress, both very, very popular, and they have like huge following on Spotify. And they actually a year and a half ago started the podcast. which is now the most popular in Slovakia, obviously, and they talk about life stuff, sex, and these kind of things. And I was following them in the beginning, and I was trying to see like how they're like communicating, and they got a ton of questions from people like saying like, oh great, you have a podcast, what is it, how do I listen to it? And so it was so funny because we kept getting the same thing, and we still are getting. Also, we use YouTube. We have used YouTube for distribution for some time now. If you read any report from Reuters or Edison Research, you will see that they also recommend using YouTube for podcast distribution. Like it has more people, like more users, more people are on YouTube, so there's like a bigger chance someone will stumble upon your podcast on YouTube and then go and subscribe to your podcast somewhere else. So this is quite a good strategy. So obviously one of the things when you start doing podcasts, like there's not a lot of data. It's not like Facebook that gives you all the interest and everything. So every year since we started, we did like a big online survey, and because we wanted to know more, we wanted to know our audience, we wanted to know like how our shows are doing, what they think about it, and we wanted to have like a bigger sample. We sampled at one time, so the Facebook discussion is great, but in terms of like online questionnaire, it's not that great when you compare it. So you get better data when you do a kind of like a basic research. So this is like a basic research we did, and we found out that who's a typical, for example, now we know who's a typical podcast listener. The podcast listener is young. So compared to a usual typical reader of our website, the podcast listener is actually 10 to 20 years younger. So they're like under 35, have a YouTube degree, sorry, not YouTube degree, a university degree. They listen to podcasts daily. They listen to more podcasts, and they earn higher than average salary. Actually, we included a voluntary question about salaries, because that's quite a great data point for us, and all like 95% of the people filled it in. I say he rather than she, but it's not actually that much. So it's like 58% of male and 42% of female who are listening to the podcast. To our podcast in Slovakia, but we are reaching so many people that I tend to say like Slovakia, but in to be honest, it's like our podcasts. So it's like young people. They listen a lot, and they listen like it was quite a surprise for us. Many people listen at home. That's their primary listening, and this was even before COVID. And a lot of people don't mind ads, so they understand. And this is actually a good segue to where I'm trying to get with the memberships and subscriptions. So we actually found out based on like these surveys and other surveys that our subscribers listen more frequently, and in their view, they're paying for the subscription. Like them paying for the subscription keeps the podcast going. That was something actually we were communicating in the beginning, like subscribe to our podcast, and you will subscribe to, like, we were communicating to our podcast listeners that if they subscribe, they can help the podcast going. So we built an audience, and we were trying to convert from listeners to subscribers. And actually, the next step was understanding the audience more, and we actually found out that it might be not about, like, podcasts might not be the best tool for us to convert listeners to subscribers, because we have a subscription, but to retain our subscribers. So in this regard, podcasts are for us more about retention. So that means let me see. Yes, so this is a great screen, which says really a lot. So our subscribers, like who pay for getting the news from SME, they love podcasts, and more than 50% of them listen to podcasts regularly. So not only our podcast, and more than 50% of the subscribers, they listen to podcasts every day. So you see, it's like a really important content for our subscribers. 20% say they listen to any of our podcasts. So that's like a huge number of your subscribers who love this, one content type you produce. And actually, we found out that they're willing to go to a premium subscription without ads and even more content, and that's like 16% of them. So again, like based on these questionnaires and the various research, we were able to get this. So it's really important when you put it all together, you get this story that it's really important to build a relationship with your listeners. And if your listeners are your subscribers and they're like addicted to your podcast, which we sometimes say like our listeners are addicted to our podcast, that it's what they tell us. So that's that's great. So you have a format where your subscribers are really hooked so they're really hooked at podcasts, and that means that they will not end the subscription. That's one of the reasons. So I link in the presentation, which I will share afterwards on Twitter. Also, EJC will definitely share all of the presentation. But there was a report 2 years ago by World Newspaper Publishers, Vanifra, and it was called "Engaged Readers Don't Churn," meaning like if you engage your readers, they don't go away. If you engage your members, your supporters, your subscribers, they will they will stay supporting you. And we change it to like engaged listeners don't churn. So there's obviously more work to be done, but when you compare like how much spend our podcast listeners with the content, it's like 3 to 4 hours. It's like a lot of time on a weekly basis. This is on a weekly basis that they spend listening to our content. And actually, when you look at averages on our website, it's only 20 minutes. So it's a hugely popular content. Obviously, there's like still a huge opportunity for the future. 2/3 of podcast listeners who are not subscribed yet are under 35. So still we need to work on the other portion to convert what I said in the beginning, that we tried to convert our listeners to our subscribers. And now we're thinking more in terms of podcasts and retention. So that's number one. But the second thing will definitely be in the future, and we will be again experimenting with this by converting listeners, like super listeners, to subscribers. Listeners keep asking for audio articles. That's something we are thinking about. We don't have a strategy for smart speakers yet. I mean, we from what they tell us, 5% of people sometimes listen to our podcast on smart speakers. So even though there is like not a language localization for Slovakia, people still use English to interact with their smart speakers and are already listening. So that's something we're definitely thinking about. And actually, we have no true crime podcast in Slovakia. From what I know and what we've seen, it's like, and as Amy before said, it's like you could hear it's really time consuming to create something like that. So I'm really great, like publications like Washington Post are doing something like that, but we're not there yet. Maybe in the future, but actually no one in Slovakia yet tried it. So maybe that's to come. So to recap, for us, podcasts help us attract younger audiences. I think that should be true for anyone starting a podcast. like it's the default audience for podcasts. I'm not saying all older generations are not listening; they are definitely, but younger generations are definitely more familiar with the format. Podcasts are help at building a lasting relationship, which you can turn like converting your listeners to subscribers and so on, and our subscribers who listen to our podcast love them, and so that's a way for them to remain subscribers. This is one last thing. This is a quote from an interview our editor-in-chief did with CEO of the New York Times company, Mark Thompson, and he actually explained that subscriptions seldom happen because of one story. Sometimes media attribute like new subscribers to one story, but he says it's about a relationship. And he actually, in the interview, he went on going and he said like they found out at the New York Times that the more types of content, meaning like their cooking app, their news app, their podcast, video, so the more types of content some of the readers come in connection with, they're more likely to subscribe. Thank you. That's my presentation. I'm not sure if I've left some time for questions, but I'll share this interview on my Twitter. And if you want any advice, just reach out. I'm happy to address anything.
Hi, David. Thank you so much for your presentation. In fact, we don't have questions, but I have one because it was already asked I think to Carolina, because also, your audience is very young, under 35. So are you thinking to go and strategize to get audiences that are older than 35?
Oh, well, actually, so we found out that some of the podcasts we have, they have older audiences. So when you break down the data from the questionnaires, so we can see actually like some of the podcasts are like more suitable for young, older audiences. So for example, we have a technology podcast, and you would say like, okay, so like innovators, young male, and it actually turns out there's a lot of like 50 plus males listening to our technology podcast. So that's one thing. We had a feminist podcast actually, which was quite popular. They got into serious topics, as we heard today, topics like that, and others, also about abortion and so on. And that was popular in I think each age category. At the moment, we don't have anything in production like for like really aimed at like older listeners. Obviously, the play is always for the youngers first, and then but no, it's a great thing that you're reminding us.
Well, maybe in the future there is time. We have two questions. One is from Linda. Linda says, hi David, great to see you at NIS again. I have a question. Do you have a specific example of what you have changed in your podcast membership strategy based on learnings from the audience survey?
Oh yeah, we're actually constantly adjusting. So I didn't go deep on this. Like I could talk about for hours about it, but like we have many examples where we had, for example, dumb example, but I think it's great. So we had an advertiser who sent us like radio ads to use in the podcast, and we actually played them, and our listeners tell us like we don't like them. So we actually went back to the advertiser and told us like let's make better ads. Again, our listeners asked us to every day in the daily news podcast to say the name day. So like today the name day of Angela, right? And that was something we actually were fighting about. Like there was like one half of the team who didn't want to do it, one half of the team who did want to do it, but then the listeners came and said like, yeah, we want this, do it. And it's actually like super popular in terms of strategy. Based on the questionnaires and the data we get, we are building new podcasts. So many people asked for a sports podcast, so we started a sports podcast. Many people asked for like more science podcasts, so now we have like 4 science podcasts, like 4 different science podcasts. So yeah, it actually helps a lot when you're listening to your listeners or readers or beat.
We have one last question before wrapping up, and the question is from Minal. Minal asks, on converting listeners to subscribers, when you studied your audience, what were the audience community expectations?
Listeners to, I'm not sure I understand the question. So when we studied the audience, we ask different questions, like if they can, like how much salary they have, like if they can afford paying a subscription, if they are willing. There was actually a straightforward question: are they willing to support us? Do they mind ads, right? So if there's like a majority of our listeners who don't mind ads and they're actually listening to them and don't minding them, so we will keep the ads. If there were like more of them, we would definitely like do something about it. And in terms of converting listeners to subscribers, so we did kind of like a campaign based on like we've seen like people would like to support us, so we try to frame it in the way that we heard people telling us they want to support us. Like people said like, we want to support you, how can we support you? And so we made a campaign for conversions which was framed like, oh, you want to support us, this is a great way to support us, subscribe to our subscriptions. You can find the link, and we had a special URL which we can then attribute to the podcast. So that was maybe one way. I'm not sure I answered the question.
Yeah, I mean, hopefully it does. I think Minal will respond soon. Thank you, David.